Under the scorching summer sun, Ewan Tolliver barreled into Redwood Station, expecting only to haggle over bank notices and haul home supplies. Instead, he found Harriet Darrow, a bride in her 40s, abandoned on the platform. Her dream wedding canceled by a family who deemed her too old. In a single daring moment, Ewan offered his hand and she took it, changing both their fates forever. What drives a man weighed down by grief to marry a stranger he just met at the station? How does a woman left stranded and heartbroken find the courage to trust again? These are the questions that sparked a wildfire of hope in a town struggling with drought debt and broken fences. Before we unravel how two wounded hearts built a home and saved an entire community, remember to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any of our heartfelt, inspiring stories. Stick around to discover if Ewan and Harriet's gamble on love can truly conquer the odds. Ewan Tolliver woke each day to the echo of his own footsteps in a house that felt far too large for one man. At 48, he carried the weight of 1,000 sun-baked afternoons on his ranch, the Alden Spread. For 3 years, his mornings began the same way he had rise before dawn. Stare at the empty side of the bed once shared with his wife Bryony, and then clench the silver locket she'd left behind. Outside, the Wyoming sky slowly shifted from charcoal to rose painting, the horizon with a promise of a new day. Yet every sunrise felt like an accusation reminding him that he was still breathing when Bryony was not. On this particular day, he knew he had to drive into Redwood Station for supplies, and the letter he dreaded one from the local bank, pressing for overdue payments. The ranch's finances had been on shaky ground ever since Bryony passed, and with her the careful bookkeeping that had kept them afloat. The drought had worsened the blow along with the medical bills that had drained every last coin from their reserves. After pulling on his worn boots, Ewan made his way out to the barn. Danny Mulligan, a hired hand, barely out of his teens, was already up tending to the cattle as he had every morning for the past year. Ewan had hired Danny out of pity, an orphan with no home, but plenty of spirit. But lately the pity flowed both ways. Danny would often glance at Ewan with a look of concern that said he recognized an ache in his employer's heart. Today was no different. Any luck with the bank? Danny asked gently, offering a small wave. Ewan shook his head, extracting a folded letter from his back pocket and tossing it onto a nearby hay bale. He had a half-dozen unopened envelopes from Redwood Bank's foreclosure office, each one a ticking bomb threatening to blow apart his legacy. The Alden Spread had been in Ewan's family for generations, and the thought of losing it cut deeper than any barbed wire fence. "Don't push yourself too hard," Danny, Ewan said after clearing his throat. "I'll be in town a while, need to settle accounts with Thompson's General and see if the postmaster has the new banknote." He tried to keep the bitterness from his voice, but it clung like dust in the dry air. Danny offered a smile that was too kind for a young man with as many problems as he had. "I'll manage here," he assured Ewan. "Fence lines near the creek need patching, and old Bessie's calf is due any time." Ewan nodded, hooking the battered wagon to his draft horse. Rogue, the animal stomped, as though sensing its owner's tension. Ewan slipped Bryony's locket into his coat pocket. Next to that dreaded letter from the bank, he touched both through the fabric as if they formed two sides of the same coin, love lost and duty unfulfilled. The morning sun now illuminated the ranch yard, revealing every flaw. Broken fence posts, peeling barn paint, and a dryness in the soil that spelled disaster for anyone trying to raise cattle. With a grim set to his jaw, he clucked at the horse and the wagon lurched into motion. If he didn't find some miracle soon, he'd have no choice but to yield to the bank's demands. But as fate often does, it waited for Ewan where he least expected it, sitting alone at Redwood Station draped in a traveling cloak, carrying a heartbreak of her own. When he left that morning, Ewan imagined returning with little more than sugar coffee and more bad news about money. Instead, he found Harriet Darrow, a woman in her early 40s, who had traveled 2,000 miles for a wedding that would never happen, abandoned on the platform. In that single moment, the course of two separate sorrowful lives would collide, setting them both on a road neither had foreseen. Harriet Darrow still felt the rocking motion of the train long after she stepped onto Redwood Station's wooden platform. She was 41, practically ancient by some people's reckoning, yet she'd nurtured the audacious dream of marriage. A week ago, she had believed herself on the brink of a new chapter, traveling from Boston to Wyoming, to wed a man she'd been corresponding with for half a year. His letters, carefully penned and full of grand promises, spoke of a small mercantile business, a warm hearth, and a future that finally honored her gentle spirit in education. But just 2 days before her arrival, a telegram reached her on the final leg of the journey. "Family objects to your age cancel wedding regret." Those clipped words played on an endless loop in Harriet's mind. They spelled not just rejection, but a public humiliation. She had left her job as a teacher, her boarding room lodging in Boston, and the few precious possessions she owned, all for a man she'd never met face to face. Now, with the train's departing whistle echoing in her ears, she realized she had nowhere to go and no one waiting for her. The telegram sat in her reticule like a dead weight, mocking her foolish hopes. Why had she not turned back at Chicago? Why not stay in Omaha and telegraph her regrets? Something in Harriet's spirit refused to bow to shame, the same stubborn pride that had seen her through a lifetime of being overlooked by suitors, wanting younger brides by employers unwilling to elevate a spinster, by relatives who viewed her as a figure of pity or polite scorn. That morning, she'd stepped onto the dusty platform at Redwood Station, thinking she would confront her fiancé and salvage whatever dignity remained. But there was no fiancé, no kindly older aunt or cousin, just the station master wringing his cap in his hands and extending a mumbled apology. Harriet sat on a bench near the station's shadowy corner, crocheting a scarf to keep her trembling fingers busy while deciding her next move. She might have still looked proud, her back straight, her chin slightly raised, but inside she felt hollow. People stared. Some tried to hide pity in their eyes. Others wore open curiosity. Harriet pretended not to notice, her gaze fixed on the crocheted pattern forming beneath her needle. The day was scorching, the sky an unrelenting expanse of blue. The dryness in the air sucked the moisture from her lips, and she silently cursed the telegraph that had arrived too late to halt her journey. She had half a mind to march to the bank or the general store, wherever her absent suitor had ties, and demand an explanation, but she knew it would be pointless. No one was waiting to hear her side. She was a woman stuck halfway between the life she'd left behind and a new one that had evaporated upon arrival. "Ma'am, are you well?" The voice that startled her sounded deep and worn, much like her own inner fatigue. She glanced up to see a man in his late 40s, tall and lean, with a broad hat shielding his face from the harsh sun. Harriet squinted, momentarily entranced by the kindness in his eyes. He introduced himself as Ewan Tolliver, a local rancher. At first, Harriet stiffened, suspecting he was simply another onlooker, pitying the abandoned bride. Yet something in his gaze reminded her of the sorrow she herself carried. Maybe it was the gentle, measured tone or the way his posture spoke of quiet resilience. I'm fine," she managed to say, her crocheting needle shaking in her hand. The scorching day, the onlookers, and the heartbreak culminating in that moment threatened to overwhelm her. But Ewan's presence acted like a buffer, an unexpected shelter from the storm swirling within her. Ewan's day had been planned as a grim checklist: retrieve supplies, dodge the bank manager, and get back to his ranch before the setting sun left the wolves to roam. Instead, here he was drawn to a stranger with a heartbreak so vividly etched on her face that it rivaled his own grief. Harriet Darrow, as she introduced herself, seemed out of place on the station bench. A refined Bostonian who didn't belong in this dusty frontier town, let alone in so humiliating a predicament. Ewan hadn't meant to pry, but a few hushed words with the station master clarified her situation. Harriet's intended wedding had collapsed like a burned-out building, leaving her stranded. Ewan sensed an odd kinship in Harriet's eyes. The emptiness of someone who'd lost something irreplaceable, who felt unmoored in a place that barely acknowledged her existence. With a careful politeness, he asked if she had a place to stay. The nearest boarding house was full, according to the station master. Harriet's trunk, containing her wedding dress and personal effects, sat in the freight office, a silent testament to broken promises. She tried to dismiss Ewan with a polite, "I'll manage," but he couldn't simply walk away. Bryony, his late wife, had always insisted that the greatest test of one's humanity was how they helped strangers who had no one else to turn to. The sun climbed higher, making Harriet's crocheted scarf look absurdly out of place. Ewan suggested they find some shade, and she allowed him to guide her to a nearby awning. Over 2 cups of watery station coffee, Harriet haltingly recounted the humiliating story she'd been writing to a local businessman in Mr. Cranston for 6 months. Their letters were warm, even affectionate enough for her to leave her East Coast life and risk the westward journey. But his mother and sisters balked at Harriet's age, labeling her beyond childbearing. A telegram was sent telling Harriet not to come, but it arrived too late. In short, Harriet was marooned with no illusions about the depth of her plight. Ewan found himself voicing a thought before he fully understood its implications. "My ranch needs a woman's touch again. I lost my wife 3 years ago. Haven't known a day's peace since." Harriet blinked in confusion, setting down her coffee. He took a breath, forging on. I have a home that's half empty, accounts in chaos, and a drought that's choking my land. I'm no man of sweet words, but I can promise decency. If you'd consider a hush fell, the station master perched not too far away nearly dropped the mailbag he'd been sorting. Harriet searched Ewan's face, trying to gauge the sincerity behind such a wild proposal. Marry a stranger. The notion was as outlandish as it was oddly reassuring. She'd walked off a train expecting marriage to a different man entirely. Now, in the same location, another proposition materialized. Ewan swallowed, conscious that he sounded half mad. I'm not trying to rescue you, Ms. Darrow. I have my own reasons. This ranch is too big for one. And I know about losing someone. I'm alone. You're alone. It might be simpler than we think. He didn't quite phrase it as romance. Indeed, it felt more like two travelers forging a pact in harsh territory, a mutual shield against the cruelties of fate. Uncertainty flickered across Harriet's features. She glanced at the trunk in the freight office, at the crocheted scarf she clutched with white knuckles, at the wished-mighty unforgiving sky overhead. Then, with a tremor in her voice, she found herself asking for specifics. What about finances? Your ranch is struggling, you said. The dryness in Ewan's throat made him cough. We're on the brink, yes, but it could turn around with your skills, your teaching, your head for figures. It might stand a chance. Harriet inhaled slowly, heart-hammering. Something about his honesty and unpolished warmth resonated with her. Was it desperation or the quiet echo of divine timing that made her even consider his offer? 5 hours later, under the unrelenting August sun, Harriet Darrow and Ewan Tolliver stood in Redwood's modest courthouse. The county clerk, a man named Sherman Willis, had known Ewan for nearly 2 decades. Willis fiddled nervously with his glasses, clearly unconvinced by the sudden request. You want a marriage license today? He glanced from Ewan's weathered face to Harriet's resolute expression. Harriet's wedding trunk, half the reason she'd come west, loomed in the corner like a silent witness. We do, Harriet answered calmly, her voice surprisingly firm, for someone who'd only met her prospective husband that morning. Ewan exhaled, removing Bryony's locket from his pocket and rubbing its engraved back. He'd used that motion as a source of strength ever since losing her. Rumors spread quickly in Redwood, and within minutes a small crowd had assembled, including the station master, a board deputy, and a few onlookers who had recognized Harriet's predicament. The general topic of conversation was that Ewan Tolliver, once known for his devout devotion to Bryony, had suddenly decided to remarry a woman abandoned at the station. Harriet felt the stares but squared her shoulders, recalling how in Boston she had faced countless pitying glances for being too old and too set in her ways. Let them gossip, she thought. Better that than living in shame with nowhere to go. Willis cleared his throat. You'll need 2 witnesses at least. And well, are you sure about this? Ewan, you can't simply bring a woman from nowhere, and she's not from nowhere. Ewan cut in quietly but with authority. Harriet's from Boston. We've made a choice to stand together, and that's reason enough. The clerk's eyes darted to Harriet, perhaps expecting her to waver. But she nodded in agreement, placing her crocheted scarf aside and signing her name in the ledger. The pen felt cold in her hand, each stroke finalizing the leap she was taking. Reverend Fulton arrived half out of breath, still pulling his minister's collar into place. Word is you two want a wedding? This day's been full of surprises, he remarked. Harriet managed a small smile, noticing the curiosity behind his mild gaze. Yes, we do, she said. Ewan stepped closer to Harriet, offering the comfort of his presence. The clerk scratched out the standard forms, reciting legal text. Harriet's name and Ewan's name appeared side by side in black ink, lines merging their fates. She recalled the adrenaline from earlier that day, stepping off the train with no fiancé waiting. Now here she was, signing the license to marry a man she too barely knew yet, who felt oddly like a second chance at a life she thought had passed her by. 2 borrowed rings materialized from the bystanders. Mrs. Otterly, who ran the boarding house, insisted Harriet take the simple gold band she had kept from her own short-lived marriage. Deputy Wilcox surrendered his ring with a stoic face, muttering that he didn't wear it since his wife's passing. Harriet's heart clenched at the quiet generosity of these near strangers. Ewan accepted them with a humble nod, slipping one onto Harriet's finger in a solemn gesture that made the gravity of their actions undeniable. In the hush that followed, only the scratch of Willis's pen and the Reverend's soft prayer could be heard. Harriet looked up into Ewan's eyes, seeing kindness and trepidation mirroring her own. Reverend Fulton cleared his throat again. By the power vested in me, and by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The crowd murmured their applause, not with the raucous cheer of a typical wedding, but with a subdued respect for two souls forging hope from heartbreak. Harriet felt the borrowed ring press against her finger, as if telling her, "You are not alone," as the midday sun bathed them in light. Harriet discovered she could indeed still smile. She was no longer Harriet Darrow, the abandoned bride. She was Harriet Tolliver standing beside a man who'd lost everything he cherished just as she had. And together they would see what the future held. The newlyweds left Redwood under a curious mixture of polite applause and hushed conversation, heading off in Ewan's wagon bound for the Alden spread. Harriet's trunk rode in the back, a silent reminder of how drastically her expectations had changed in a single morning. She sat beside Ewan, absorbing the rolling plains and jagged rock formations that surrounded them, marveling at the vastness. It was a far cry from Boston's buildings and cobblestone streets. Out here, the horizon stretched on forever, as limitless as the new marriage she'd entered on a whim. It wasn't until they were a mile out of town that Harriet dared exhale. Ewan's grip on the res seemed firm, but nervous, as though he were trying not to show how uncertain he felt. She touched the borrowed ring on her finger, a modest gold band with a small scuff on the edge. This ring borrowed from the clerk's wife. "Should I be worried it's a bad omen?" she asked lightly, breaking the tension. Ewan shook his head, half smiling. "I don't put stock in omens. My first wedding ring was a piece of Bryony's mother's jewelry. Nothing fancy. We had 7 years of happiness until—" He swallowed, and Harriet watched the sorrow reappear in his eyes. "What matters is the promise you carry in your heart," he added softly. She found herself placing a hand on his arm. They fell into silence for several minutes as the horses clopped along. The land opened up before them, tufts of sagebrush, the occasional cottonwood near a winding creek, distant shapes of cattle grazing. Harriet had grown up reading stories of the West, but never imagined it would be so raw, so grand, and so ripe with both danger and promise. "Did Bryony like it here?" she asked gently, bridging the subject that felt like a ghost between them. Ewan's shoulders relaxed a fraction. "She did. She was a teacher like you, actually. She taught the neighboring ranch kids their letters numbers. Everyone adored her. That's part of why losing her hit so hard. The house got too quiet." Harriet nodded, feeling an odd kinship with a woman she'd never meet. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and she meant it not as a platitude, but as someone who knew heartbreak intimately. They crested a small ridge, and Ewan pointed out a lone cluster of buildings in the distance, the ranch house. A couple of outbuildings and a weathered barn. "That's the Alden spread. It doesn't look like much from here, but once it was prosperous," he explained. Harriet tried to see it through his eyes. Once thriving land, now marked by drought and the hush of disuse. She noticed a few broken fence lines and roofing shingles missing from the barn. The orchard near the house looked stunted, likely from lack of water. "We'll make it a home again," Harriet heard herself say with a conviction that startled her. Ewan glanced at her, surprised by her readiness to claim this place, as well as the marriage she'd stepped into so unexpectedly. As they rolled into the ranch yard, Danny Mulligan appeared, hat in hand, eyes wide at the sight of Harriet. Ewan offered a short introduction, explaining that Harriet was now Mrs. Tolliver. The young man's astonishment only lasted a second before he doffed his cap, bowing with exaggerated gallantry. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am." "That's a turn of events, for sure, but we need something to break the gloom around here," he added, earning a withering look from Ewan that had no real heat behind it. Harriet fought back a nervous laugh. "It's lovely to meet you too, Danny," she replied kindly, climbing down from the wagon with a poise that belied her turmoil. Half an hour later, Harriet was inside the ranch house, standing in a large open space that served as both living area and dining room. It smelled of dust and neglect. A layer of gloom clung to the corners of the high ceilings. She could envision how Bryony's presence might have lit up this space with laughter and comfort. Harriet's trunk rested near the fireplace, as though waiting for permission to belong. "It's not grand, but it's ours," Ewan said, carrying in the last of their supplies. Harriet looked around, letting the reality settle. This was her home now. She wasn't stepping into a dream wedding she'd planned. She was stepping into a life that might just prove more real and fulfilling than any fantasy. Harriet woke the next morning to find the ranch house cloaked in the hush of dawn. She'd slept in a small room that smelled of old cedar and lavender sachets. Presumably, once used by Bryony, Ewan had retired to the barn loft, giving Harriet space to adjust. Sitting on the edge of the neatly made bed, Harriet felt the rustling skirts of her nightdress, aware that the day would be shaped by chores, unfamiliar tasks, and a swirl of unspoken questions about how to proceed. She stepped into the main room to find a pot of coffee on the stove and a note from Ewan scribbled in a clumsy but earnest hand. Gone to fix a fence with Danny. Be back by noon. There's bread in the pantry. She exhaled, then found a broom in a corner and began a thorough sweep. The floor was coated in a fine layer of dust, as though the house had been waiting for new life to reawaken it. Harriet's mind buzzed with ideas: how to tidy the kitchen, reorganize the shelves, and perhaps tend a small garden, if the soil allowed. She was, after all, a teacher, skilled at taming chaos. Why not begin here? By midday, the house had breathed out some of its gloom. Harriet had also located Bryony's old cast-iron skillet, its surface crying out for reseasoning. The quiet gave her plenty of time to recall the stunned reaction from Redwood's townsfolk and her own stunned reaction to Ewan's heartfelt gaze at the station. She reminded herself this was not a real honeymoon, nor a conventional romance, but maybe it could become something akin to a genuine partnership. When Ewan and Danny returned, they smelled of sweat and outdoors. Harriet offered them fresh water, her housekeeping instincts kicking in. Danny whistled appreciatively at the home's newfound order. "Miss Harriet, you've done wonders in half a day," he said, removing his hat. Ewan shot Harriet a half-smile, equal parts gratitude and curiosity. "You didn't have to do all this," he murmured. She shrugged lightly. "I wanted to, then turned to fetch some bread and butter." The conversation drifted to practical matters, fence lines that needed reposting, the accounts Harriet had asked to see, and the looming presence of the bank. Harriet's brow furrowed. "If you have records or receipts, I can help untangle them. I was a teacher, yes, but I also handled budgets for the boarding school. Numbers can't be that different from place to place." Ewan hesitated, then nodded. A good chunk of Bryony's ledgers might still be in her desk. Harriet saw the flicker of pain in his eyes at mentioning Bryony's name. He gestured to a small writing desk in the corner, layered with unopened letters and dusty ledgers. Harriet approached it gingerly, as though intruding on a sacred space. She opened the desk's top drawer to reveal carefully stacked stationery, an inkwell dried up, and an old ledger labeled Household Accounts. Harriet's heart squeezed at the neat handwriting on the cover. Bryony's script, Alden Ranch. She found herself running her finger over the loops and lines. "We can pick up where she left off," Harriet said softly. "Honor her by continuing her good work." Ewan's posture relaxed, as if hearing that suggestion released some hidden guilt. He drew closer, peering over her shoulder at the ledger's columns. "I never learned how she balanced everything so precisely," he admitted. Harriet scanned the entries: feed costs, supply orders, winter hay calculations. "She was efficient," Harriet remarked, reading the last lines from 3 years ago, just before Bryony fell ill. "I can follow her method. We can recalculate for the current cattle count, the drought conditions, and see if there's a path forward." A flicker of hope sparked in Ewan's eyes. Outside, the midday sun glimmered on the dusty yard, highlighting the dryness. But inside this quiet old house, Harriet held a ledger that might hold the key to saving the Alden spread. And though neither Ewan nor Harriet spoke it aloud, they both sensed that love, like ranching, demanded a certain faith in tomorrow. Within a week, Harriet had spread an array of ledgers, receipts, and notes across the old kitchen table. Her academic mind attacked the problem of the Alden spread's finances with relish. Each column of numbers became a puzzle piece, and she pinned them together into a big picture. Ewan and Danny watched in awe as Harriet calmly lined up their revenue streams: cattle sales, a few orchard products, against their expenses, feed repairs, wages, the dreaded bank interest. Harriet had always found comfort in the logic of numbers, seeing them as honest friends who told hard truths. On the 8th morning, Harriet looked up from a particularly tangled account of feed costs and sighed. "We're short on feed for winter, and the bank's interest alone is smothering us. The orchard's yield won't be enough." Ewan had just stepped in from a round of fence checks, removing his hat and wiping sweat from his brow. "Is there any fix?" Harriet nodded, though her expression was serious. "Yes, but it's not easy. We either need more consistent income or a reevaluation of the bank terms, possibly both." Danny whistled, leaning against the doorway. "Reevaluation. Redwood Bank never budges, Miss Harriet. They make a coyote look tame." Still, Harriet had an idea. She recalled how in Boston she'd taught evening classes to local merchants who needed to keep better books for their shops. "If we could persuade Redwood Bank's manager that bridging finance for local ranches is better than for closing them, we might unify the ranchers. Show them a business model that invests in communities rather than discarding them. But for that, we need clout. Harriet's mind buzzed with possibilities. Alternatively, we expand. Create a small school for local kids. Everyone wants their children to read, write, and do math. They'll pay tuition or trade in produce or goods. That money or trade could reduce how much we rely on the bank. Ewan considered the proposition. People around here are proud they might not see the point in a formal school if their kids already handle chores. And that is exactly where we prove its value. Harriet insisted, numbers are vital for ranching, so are writing skills for communication. We can spin it as practical, not just fancy city notions. With the plan taking shape, Harriet felt an excitement reminiscent of her teaching days. She drafted a flyer that evening announcing the Alden School for Practical Learning to be held in an unused wing of the ranch house. Danny, can you spread these around town? Harriet asked, handing him the stack. He nodded, eager to help. Will do, Miss Harriet. I'll pin 'em at the general store, the post office, the saloon, maybe? Ewan smiled, but Harriet could read the worry behind it. You're braver than I am, he remarked. I've faced storms and wolves, but never tried to corral ranchers into sending their kids to a teacher. Harriet gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. We'll be forging alliances, not fighting a war. And who knows, maybe Redwood Bank will see it as a sign of progress. If enough families get behind it, it might shift the power dynamic. The notion that she, a stranger from Boston, might become the impetus for saving Ewan's ancestral ranch felt at once exhilarating and daunting. But Harriet had faced storms of her own. If fate had dropped her here, perhaps her role was to help shape a more hopeful tomorrow. Word of Harriet's plan spread through Redwood in a matter of days. Curious parents, hardened ranchers, and some of the older children themselves rode out to the Alden spread. They wanted to see the newly cleaned and partially renovated wing where Harriet hoped to create a schoolhouse. The big drafty space, once intended for expansions or storage, now had chalkboards Harriet had scavenged from an abandoned barn, rough-hewn benches carved by Ewan and Danny, and a scattering of the books Harriet had brought from Boston. Harriet insisted the classes be open to all ages. Reading and arithmetic shouldn't be luxuries for a chosen few. She told the first small group that arrived. Ewan observed from the sidelines, sorting the financial ledgers each evening, amazed at Harriet's energy. She juggled lesson planning with ranch chores, often falling asleep at the table, her ink-stained fingertips resting on their combined finances. He found himself picking up slack around the ranch, as if wanting to shield Harriet's efforts from small inconveniences like retarring the barn roof or hauling extra water for the orchard. Where once he had allowed neglect to creep in, Briney's orchard now thrived under Harriet's direction, culminating in a modest but promising apple harvest. The apples, along with fresh biscuits Harriet baked, became staple snacks for the children who attended the informal daily lessons. Tommy Mulligan joined the adult evening session, learning advanced arithmetic so he could manage his wages and read better. His mother, Mrs. Mulligan, arrived one evening with a fresh-baked pie in hand, tears glistening as she thanked Harriet. I never dreamed my boy would have the chance to do more than rope and fence. I see him reading at night now by lamplight. Harriet smiled, feeling a pang of nostalgia for her old classroom back in Boston, but recognized that here on the rugged frontier, the changes she introduced were even more life-altering. Yet not everyone was thrilled. Redwood Bank's manager, Vaughn Ellsworth, paid an unexpected visit. A stout man with narrow eyes, he carried himself with the authority of someone used to seeing folks beg for extensions on their loans. He arrived on a Friday afternoon, stepping into the nearly finished school wing without removing his hat. So this is your enterprise, Mrs. Tolliver? He sneered, glancing around at the humble setup. Harriet nodded politely. Yes, it's a start. I plan to help these families become stronger in their bookkeeping and reading, improving their prospects and hopefully stabilizing their finances. Ellsworth eyed Ewan, lurking near the door. And how does that help you pay down your debt, Tolliver? Ewan bristled, but Harriet took the lead. It might not directly pay the mortgage, she said calmly, but an educated community invests in each other. If ranchers thrive, so does Redwood Bank, and so does everyone, including us. Ellsworth snorted, fiddling with the papers in his vest pocket. We'll see about that. The bank won't wait forever. With that, he left. Harriet looked at Ewan, noticing the tension in his jaw. We stay the course, she whispered, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. We prove our worth to each other and this community. And so they did, day by day. The children learned to read and do sums. Harriet discovered that half of them had minds ripe for more advanced lessons. Soon the name Alden Spread School was spoken with respect, not just mild curiosity. Families started to pay in eggs produce, or small coin, Harriet meticulously recorded these barter transactions in a ledger. Over the weeks, the small changes aggregated. Ewan and Harriet had enough spare produce to sell in town. The orchard's apples were used to bake goods that brought in a bit more income, and some ranchers offered labor in exchange for Harriet's classes. Even Redwood Station's telegraph operator recognized Harriet's skill, handing Ewan a letter from a distant cousin of Harriet's, who, upon hearing Harriet's predicament, enclosed a small sum. Harriet called it a miracle of small blessings. Still, the bank's demands loomed like storm clouds on the horizon, and winter approached with a fierceness that could undo all their gains. Harriet refused to let the threat crush their newfound hope. She found old receipts proving Redwood Bank had possibly charged higher interest to Ewan than to other ranchers. She compiled data ready to confront Ellsworth if need be. "You're incredible," Ewan told her one night as they reviewed the next month's budget. Outside, the wind howled, but Harriet's eyes shone with unwavering resolve. "I just never believed in giving up. Not even when I was left at a train station," she said quietly, setting her pen aside. "If you're determined enough, you find a way." Ewan nodded, deeply moved, realizing that Harriet's determination might be exactly what this ranch in his heart had needed all along. Winter announced itself one November morning. With a bitter wind and dark clouds rolling across the sky, Harriet stood in the newly organized classroom, chalk in hand, finishing the day's arithmetic problems as the children arrived. Their cheeks were red from the cold, but they eagerly picked seats on the simple benches. Each had a slate and a piece of chalk Harriet had carefully rationed from her supplies. In the back, a pot-bellied stove glowed orange burning wood that Ewan and Danny had gathered. The crackle of flames provided comfort amid the swirling snow. Outside, Ewan peeked in, nodding at Harriet with a smile. He was on his way to the orchard, needing to check if the last of the apples had frozen. Harriet planned to finalize the orchard's yield ledger that afternoon. She felt a rush of pride in how far they'd come this marriage. That began as a hasty arrangement now pulsated with shared purpose, bridging their combined grief with practical day-to-day tasks. The children's laughter replaced the ranch's old lonely silences. Harriet set them to work on sums. If a rancher has 30 cows and sells 10 for $15 each, how much does he earn? The hush as they calculated reminded her of her Boston classroom, except the stakes felt more real here. These children needed to know that math could save them from exploitative bank terms and unscrupulous traders. The sun was hidden by the storm clouds, plunging the day into a premature dusk. Harriet rose to light an extra lantern. Suddenly, the door burst open, letting in a blast of cold air and a man Harriet recognized from Redwood Bank, Carlisle, one of Ellsworth's associates. He was out of breath, eyes darting around the rudimentary classroom with undisguised disdain. "Ewan Tolliver." "Is he about Carlisle?" demanded Harriet, shielded the children behind her. "He's out checking the orchard." "What is your business here?" Carlisle hesitated, removing his hat. "The bank manager told me to serve an official notice. Redwood Bank found irregularities in the Alden Spreads account. They demand immediate payment or will proceed with foreclosure." The words cut through Harriet like a shard of ice. She waved for the children to gather their things. "Class dismissed for the day. Children," she announced, voice clipped. "Follow Miss Jane. She'll see you safely to the station or home." A volunteer assistant, Miss Jane, hustled them out while Harriet faced Carlisle squarely. "We're not uncooperative. We've found evidence Redwood Bank may be imposing higher interest rates on ranchers struggling in the drought. We plan to confront Mr. Ellsworth about that." Carlisle shrugged. "That's not my department. I only know Ellsworth wants the debt cleared or the property's forfeit." Harriet's heart pounded, recalling the weeks of progress. Could it all unravel so quickly? "I'll see to it," she managed, "when Ewan returns. But mark my words, Redwood Bank's strong-arm tactics won't go unanswered." The man grunted dismissively. As he left, Harriet stood alone in the half-lit classroom, the arithmetic still on the board, innocent sums that had no idea how close this ranch was to losing everything. She felt a momentary collapse of the hope she'd been weaving. Then she drew a breath. She had faced heartbreak, had faced being left at a station with no future, yet found courage. This was another test. By the time Ewan came in from the orchard, his coat dusted with snow, Harriet had pulled out all the ledgers, determined to assemble a case that Redwood Bank's interest rate manipulations were both unethical and possibly illegal. She recounted Carlisle's visit, voice steady. Ewan's face hardened. "So the fight's at our doorstep," he said grimly. Harriet reached for his hand, ignoring the battered ring. "We stand together," she whispered, "and we do not yield." In the days that followed, Harriet and Ewan discovered an unanticipated ally in the form of Mrs. Townsend, an elderly woman whose late husband had served as Redwood Bank's accountant years earlier. She came forward with old ledgers and testimonies that indicated the bank frequently exploited ranchers by inflating fees during drought years. With Harriet's sharp mind for numbers, they compiled evidence meticulously. The entire community rallied behind them. Ranchers gave statements about unfair interest spikes. Families lamented how Redwood Bank made them sign near impossible repayment terms. Even Redwood's new local newspaper printed an editorial exposing the bank's hard-handedness. Faced with this gathering storm of public opinion and actual data, Ellsworth tried to threaten Harriet with talk of legal ramifications for slander. But Harriet, speaking from the small dais in their classroom-turned-public meeting hall, countered with calm logic and the unwavering support of Redwood's newly educated citizens. The result was a negotiated compromise. Redwood Bank reduced the interest burden on several ranches, including the Alden Spread, allowing them to pay off debts without losing their land. A sense of collective victory swept through Redwood. Harriet and Ewan, in many ways the catalyst for change, found themselves leading a celebration at the local church hall. There was music, dancing, and heartfelt speeches. Harriet laughed as Ewan spun her around the dance floor, her austere Boston formality melting into pure joy. Yet for all the public triumph, Harriet cherished the private victory of a home revived. The orchard bore enough fruit to sell at a modest profit. The classroom bustled with not just children, but older ranchers who realized Harriet's lessons on bookkeeping weren't idle theory. They were lifelines, and Ewan, the shadows under his eyes gradually lifted as if some hidden part of his heart had finally healed enough to let in new light. One crisp winter morning, Harriet woke to find a small box on the kitchen table. Inside lay two new wedding bands carefully engraved with swirling patterns, reminiscent of morning glories. A simple note read, "Because these borrowed rings were just the beginning." Harriet felt tears warm her cheeks. She discovered Ewan in the orchard, his breath visible in the cold air. Wordlessly, she showed him the rings. He slid one onto her finger, the metal warming against her skin. She returned the gesture, feeling her pulse quicken in the hush of the orchard. "I never imagined happiness would find me out here," she whispered. "Certainly not after being left at a station with everything I owned in a trunk." Ewan brushed a tendril of hair from her face. "I never imagined I'd find purpose again after Bryony. But I have." As the sun broke over the horizon, morning glories half buried in the snow valiantly reached for daylight, much like Harriet and Ewan had reached for each other. By forging a union built on mutual respect, grief shared, and hope chosen, they achieved more than financial stability. They created a living testament that love can indeed be resurrected from heartbreak. Each new day reaffirmed that while heartbreak might close one door, faith and courage can open an unexpected window to the future. In Redwood, Harriet and Ewan Tolliver stood side by side, co-teaching, co-ranching, and co-believing in a life that seamlessly blended practical partnership with the gentle unfolding of love. Their story became a legend, retold every time a new train pulled into Redwood Station, where a solitary bench once held an abandoned bride. Now it signified new beginnings for all who dared to believe that sometimes being left behind can lead to being truly found. As I reflect on Ewan and Harriet's journey, I see more than just a sudden wedding or a battle against ruthless creditors. Their story reveals how courage can mend the most broken places, be it a neglected ranch or a wounded heart. Harriet transformed the Alden Spread not by sweeping aside the past, but by weaving together her strengths with Ewan's honoring Bryony's memory while forging a future. Ewan discovered that loss doesn't mean giving up love. It means carrying cherished memories into a new chapter. The result is a vibrant community where old fences are mended, new friendships bloom, and possibility flourishes like wildflowers after rain. What do you think of their bold choice and the life they've built? We'd love to hear your thoughts. So leave a comment and let's discuss. If this story touched your heart, make sure you're subscribed for more tales of hope, resilience, and second chances.